My name is Kim Roche. I'm a conservator with Clemson's Warren Lash Conservation Center. We are based down in North Charleston, actually, on the old naval base down there, if people are familiar with the area. So really, as someone who grew up in Florida, hurricane season was always kind of a part of my normal summer schedule, which I appreciate. Not everyone grows up with that kind of experience. And once I got into heritage, I realized the immediate need kind of at the intersection of both, not just with water risks, but with all kinds of emergencies as well. So this is, what started as a pet project. I'm sure Megan, you all here, with Nahar especially, have found that when you start working in that intersection, there's all of a sudden a lot of people looking to you as a resource or, to help provide training, expertise, et cetera. So today I'm just going to kind of take you through really how we got here in the heritage sector, kind of the genesis of emergency preparedness for heritage, and really focusing on the Alliance for Response initiative, which we've just launched in the Lowcountry. So it's been a big part of my job the last couple of years, just getting it off the ground. So it's exciting to finally be able to share some information, especially after a few COVID delays. So looking at, the genesis, as I said, of emergency preparedness in the heritage sector, these are the Heritage Health Index survey results, which really kind of sent alarms blaring in the heritage sector. So looking at, historical societies, archives, libraries, museums, scientific collections, you can kind of see the breakdown here of different types of collections that were surveyed. It is worth noting, of course, that these are tangible collections. They're not necessarily looking at sites, architectural resources, and that was definitely something we took big note of in the Lowcountry when we were working on bringing more emergency preparedness and training resources to the area. So of course, panic bells start going off when you see numbers like 22% had updated emergency plans. And of course, if the answer is, to the question, I don't know, that's a no. So unless you know where it is, how to access it, it doesn't really count. Again, looking at staff training, so this was back in 2004. I don't think it's any surprise to any of us here working in heritage that there's a direct correlation between the percentage of collections that have dedicated paid staff for conservation preservation versus the percentage that had written plans with staff training. So, it's basically those who have staff training or written emergency plans also have staff training and not a lot of gap in between. In 2014, after a rush of initiatives, fortunately, we do see that number go up. So we do see about the doubling of those with written emergency plans. So that is a good place to start. However, a big shortfall still where it comes to actual hands-on training and those ready to respond. Even at my own institutions in the past and present, it tends to be the newbie that is given this task or the intern, the volunteer, because no one really wants to do it. However, it really needs to come from the person most experienced, whether it's, a site manager, the archaeologist, a custodian, the senior conservator, collections manager. All of those people need to be intimately involved in writing the plans and overseeing staff training. So just a few takeaways from the 2014 survey. Of course, this is a weighted average, so those numbers are horrifying, just the average in and of itself. But if you start to think about what it probably looks like for small scale institutions, more rural organizations, I'm sure it's even more horrifying. I've dug through the data myself and it's not great. So especially when you think of states like South Carolina, especially in the Southeast, we do tend to have a lot more smaller custodian run, maybe 1 to 3 sort of paid staff, if at all, collections. So that was something that we were looking very closely at. I also think it's really important to note that they did flag the need for preservation strategies for born digital collections. So that is a very important aspect that, especially in the archaeology world, if you lose the context, the provenience information, you essentially lose what makes the object significant. So if you have no backup, even with the ransomware attacks we see on a regular basis now in infrastructure, Museum collections are not immune to that sort of attack either. So, it's good to have redundancies there. We were lucky enough to have an IT specialist who had considered this before I even had to ask him. So approaching my first hurricane season here at my institution, I remember taking this question to him. He said, yes, when I started, I made a note that we're about 6 inches above sea level. And there was no redundancy for our server backup system. So fortunately, he had that foresight to do it. But had I not asked the question, I wouldn't have known that he had taken those steps. And of course, just in general in the heritage sector, I think we all know that, people are incredibly taxed and overwhelmed and often focused on triage rather than foresight and, pre-planning. But the good news was that out of this kind of panic attack, within the sector, there was a rush of initiatives, both for tangible collections and archaeological custodianship. So you can see just a few of those here. However, again, that doesn't always trickle down. So who is on these email lists, if it's a volunteer-run site or an individual custodian managing this who's not on any sort of official registry, they're not getting this information. They may not even be eligible for the funding it could provide. So this kind of brings us to the Alliance for Response initiative, which is managed by the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation, so FAIC, which is sort of the foundational wing of the professional conservation body in the US. So they launched this initiative in 2003 with the aim of safeguarding historic collections during emergencies and fostering local relationships. So it's now 31 networks strong, with 2 more in development, that being us in Chicago, which both just launched within the last couple of weeks. So they've officially reached more than 1,000 collecting institutions across the country through this initiative. And one of the benefits, I think, of this model is that it's really adaptive. So we weren't really tied to any sort of formal structure. It was really largely up to us to decide what kind of geographical area we wanted to cover, what sort of presenters we wanted to have for our, launch event conference. All of that was really, by and large, left up to us to decide based on the needs of our local region. So I'll get into a bit more of that and kind of the logistics of planning that, working with FAIC a bit later. So of course, why we plan, we all know the horror stories, whether it's a historic house caught on fire, theft, bomb blast in Beirut that projected forward a display case of Phoenician glass, which basically had to be picked up and excavated as if it were, an archaeological excavation itself. It can be something as mundane as, poor storage conditions that lead to, surface corrosion of objects. A tourist catches themselves on, 16th century Chinese vases. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of issues with this because cultural sites were shuttered. There wasn't always a continuity of operations in place. So there was no one to walk through, check facilities, check collections. So then, there are examples like the Getty, which had a horrific, I can't remember which pest it was, but, it was pretty gnarly, and they were quite literally taking dental picks to get bugs out between planks in the floor. So they had a massive pest outbreak. And again, with archaeological sites, you can see them, quite literally disappearing, being consumed by the sea while you're waiting for funding to come through. So of course, we all know this is really just my slide to say, hi, help us. We have 1,000,001 responsibilities and no one really to help us with this. We're always underpaid, understaffed, underfunded, right? So when it comes to emergency planning and staff training, the people that end up being responsible for this cover all aspects of the preservation field, whether it's archaeologists, archivists, librarians, preservation specialists, architectural historians, even curators, urban planners, oftentimes a lot of volunteers and interns to help along the way. And we, of course, have to wear many hats. We have to think of a lot of things on a daily basis. We're juggling a lot of projects. Of course, the local need to generate revenue in every sector. means we're often working, even if you're at a public institution, you're still working on private projects as well. And then of course, providing training opportunities, outreach. And this does become, in my opinion, a high risk of insularity because we are looking to other heritage professionals who are battling, the same conditions that we are, or come from the same backgrounds. So that training is often coming from people in our own sector, which is, very important. And that is, absolutely the place to start. However, we do need to be looping in emergency managers, first responders, because they might show up and we think we know everything, or, we have a solid plan, and then, we're speaking two different languages, basically. So having that sort of conversation in advance is really important. It doesn't mean every individual custodian or site manager has to be speaking with, their local rep first. It just means that, even more on a local scale, emergency managers, first responders need to know that we're having these conversations and planning for these things, because oftentimes they're unaware that this is even something they should care about, which, I'm sure Meg has talked to you about, and she and I certainly deal with quite a bit, especially lately. And of course, staff are the key in the heart to collections. You all know what is of most value, what's most important, whether it's a specific area of a site or an artifact that everyone comes to visit, and that is the biggest revenue generator for your institution, and therefore maybe isn't, of monetary value or even the biggest cultural significance, but is important in terms of continuity of operation. So, it's these kinds of little nitty-gritty things that you all are most competent to answer. And of course, we all know our institutions the best, where the bodies are buried at your institutions, or, your specific organizations. We all have them. We all know where that closet door is that you never open and don't tell anyone exists. So of course, these things are really important for any sort of emergency event. And of course, we have to consider so many things, especially these days. Look at the world we're living in. It's not just agents of deteriorations of artifacts anymore. It's man-made versus natural. It's internal versus external disasters, long-term power outages, ransomware attacks, pandemics. The list is never ending. Active shooter situations at our workplace. So it's, it can be certainly overwhelming. And that's why I would not at all recommend you plan by an emergency to emergency basis, because that's not going to be a winning strategy. Your emergency plan is probably going to be about 3,000 pages long, especially these days, and you won't be able to find the information you need in a pinch. So of course, looking at plans and staff training, why do we have them? What is most important? So here is a really good example from the Jagger Library, the University of Cape Town, which unfortunately was engulfed during a nearby wildfire. So you can see where it's very useful to have a written plan, both to have emergency resources when you need them. So whether that's, drying pads, markers, even shop vac, or just having an emergency phone call list really is really crucial. So here you can see where they're maintaining the accession numbers, writing down what's wet or dry, maintaining that chain of information during an emergency and right after is super important. And that's why you guys are so lucky to have Meg, who has, extensive, unfortunately for her, salvage experience. It is very rare to have that. We're very lucky to have her in South Carolina, but also just working with collections and in the Southeast, she's a wonderful, wonderful resource and is absolutely number one on my call list in the event of anything going south. Even just for emotional support, it's good to have those people to call. So you can see where they're stacking books, the tent's been set up. Pretty much all of these procedures were set in motion ahead of time because they had plans and staff were trained to deal with this. So when an emergency happens, where do we fit on a command structure? This is a good place to look. Of course, if it's a regional event like a hurricane, you really have no role at all. I wouldn't really expect to have one. You're not going to be allowed in until the general public is, by and large. We are working on that, trying to get more communication so that we do have at least, access at some point, because we are important stakeholders in a recovery. But just looking at, kind of key functions under a heritage response team would generally include a recorder, so someone taking notes if objects are moving, if it's going from one triage area to another, or it's being sent off-site for freezing. What's a total loss and being tossed? Sometimes that happens. Then you want someone ideally in charge of triage, so you're not having conflicting messaging and responsibilities. Transporter if things are moving around, dryer packing if you're shipping things off. So again, just designated responsibilities. And if you don't have this set up ahead of time, that's fine. What you do need is to have at least a clear point of authority to designate these positions during a response. So of course, an incident command system structure is not the same as your day-to-day operations. It doesn't mean it's the director or the head of your organization. I am the emergency preparedness coordinator for my institution. If, push comes to shove and we have to do this, I'm the team leader and I'm appointing people to the respective positions. I'm not the director. I'm not actually even the senior conservator. So it's, it's all about who knows the collection best sometimes. And local connections first. Your neighbors and friends will always be the first to respond to you. This is, both on an emergency response level, but also within the preservation field. So knowing who you can call, whether it's just for information, is really important. So of course, emergency responders, please always call 911 first. I think everyone knows that, staff matter first. Collections can be dealt with later, once human safety is obviously always going to be the priority. There are some 24/7 response numbers that you can call. So the National Heritage Responders, also managed by FAIC, of which I am one, the Northeast Document Conservation Center. The National Heritage Responders especially has a good range of specialties. I would say any DCC focuses a lot on digital collections, archive, library, digital media especially. So if you have anything along those lines, any DCC would be a great place to start. National Heritage Responders as well, especially if it's not urgent and you just want to reach a certain specialist, you can always email. So I have that information on the next slide for y'all. And of course, your local conservation preservation personnel, even if it's Meg in Columbia saying, please get down here, I need someone to, speak to the volunteers and prep them because what's going on and I don't have time to do that. Of course, disaster recovery vendors, if you're going to need external support, always have that information ahead of time. At the forum, actually, we had a representative from Balfour there, which I was excited to speak with them about, potentially local freezer storage. And in doing so, found out that, unfortunately, as Meg and I suspected, but I have since now confirmed, their freezer site is in Texas. So Meg and I still have not pinpointed any sort of freezer storage in our state that could be used in a crisis or set up as an advanced vendor. So that's definitely something that we've prioritized to work on in the coming months to years. And of course, battle buddies. So this is something that I've worked to set up, especially amongst the planning committee members of our initiative and conference. So we know that having the time to dedicate resources to this is in fact even a luxury within Heritage. And we're trying to leverage those resources by sort of buddying up with institutions that maybe don't have as many resources or dedicated paid preservation conservation staff. So here's again just some of those breakdowns of numbers and resources you can call. Association for Preservation Technology is great for architectural and structural resources. And of course, local connections first. These are always going to be the people that will respond to you, most quickly. So what makes the Lowcountry unique, and how did we adapt the initiative for our purposes? So looking especially at the cultural and geographic considerations, Previously, there's generally been an urban focus, and it's been large, kind of the privileged elite institutions we tend to think of, like the Library of Congress in DC, the Met in New York, those types of institutions. And that is important because they do have resources. However, we wanted to look not just at what Lowcountry heritage is, but also who manages that. So there especially we have historic trades, foodways, sites of warships, museums and attractions, archaeological sites, historic communities and neighborhoods, cultural landscapes. It's much more than just museums. And I would say actually museums would be in the minority of the types of collections we should be looking at. So that was immediately something I wanted to kind of switch around and decentralize from being the focus of the initiative. Again, of course, those that have the time to put someone on the planning committee for this, Drayton Hall, Historic Charleston, Charleston Library Society, South Carolina Historical Society, those are, again, what we would consider the privileged institutions of Charleston. They have, dedicated paid staff who are given time in the workday to support this. But that's not really what we see throughout the state. So, looking at, again, the, more than just urban centers. And really the role of volunteer custodians in our collections in our area. And, as I kind of mentioned to you before, when we were looking at the statistics, it's important to consider the size of collections and the number of heritage custodians at each collection. And that's definitely something I'm prioritizing in terms of getting a good pulse check on going forward. And then of course, geographically, we have 1,001 region-specific threats. According to our Charleston County emergency manager, there's only 2 natural or man-made disasters we don't have to consider, and that's volcanoes and sandstorms. So everything else is really fair game in terms of Charleston and Lowcountry planning. And of course, just, a few little sites of, tangible heritage that make us unique. But again, it's really the cultural landscapes and the neighborhoods, in my opinion, that are the heart and soul of the Lowcountry legacy. And these historic communities, especially, with the massive developments we see, sea level rise, coastal erosion, are at the biggest threat of being wiped out completely, with very few resources standing between them. I also like to point out that historic and cultural communities are more resistant to the growth, stagnation, decline destination life cycle model, meaning that, like a lot of tourist cities that, tend to explode and then die off, at some point fairly quickly, having cultural and heritage sites make them very resistant to this. So it's something that provides a lot of, economic buffer zone, if you will. And something that we definitely need to be better about banging the drum about, for sure. And in South Carolina in particular, the cultural and natural resources were credited as our economic recovery during the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, something we need to be a lot louder and more vocal about in order to leverage those resources. Just highlighting some of the planning committee members, which you'll see in full in a moment, just some of the tangible assets in the city, whether it's a Shakespeare folio or, the oldest example of Palladian architecture in North America. Drayton Hall is a really unique site because they are, it's an architectural resource. It's an archaeological site. There are historic collections inside. It is a cultural landscape. So they kind of have it all that they have to plan for, and are also a really wonderful resource here in the area. Avery Research Center, the lovely Georgette Mayo, a processing archivist, served as the vice chair for this initiative. And here you can see the Avery Research Center in downtown Charleston. They preserve and promote archival collections and artifacts, highlighting the various facets of Black life in Charleston and the Lowcountry, and have been a wonderful resource. This is the Seashore Farmers Lodge Museum, which is on Solagri Island. It's a historically Black beach and settlement community. So this was actually sort of an early union that was formed amongst a conglomerate of Black farmers at the time, and they would actually pay in dues and have, certain privileges like burial fees that would be covered for funerals in the event that, they passed on. So this was, of course, highly illegal at the time. However, they persevered, met in, pretty much silence, hidden sites, and the site had really fallen into disrepair. And through a local community effort, they were able to rehab this and bring it back to life, and has become a big draw, not just on Solagri Island, but also within the Lowcountry. So you can see standing on the porch there is the lovely Ernest Parks, who is really the heart and soul behind this. He's driven the entire initiative forward over the last several decades. And his nephew, Joshua Parks, is also an associate curator along with him, all volunteer-based as well. Another historic settlement community, this one in North Charleston, also where development has become a big problem. So Avery Research Center has partnered up with them and worked very closely with them. I should mention with the Seashore Farmers Lodge as well, various Clemson grants efforts, as well as Historic Charleston, have been involved in assisting with the rehabilitation project there. Phillips Community, a third example here in Charleston. So Mount Pleasant, more specifically, was facing extensive development. You can see in the bottom left, that was planned interstate development, which would have bifurcated the historic community. And this was after they already dealt with, major community impacts due to development around them. So what had been, kind of raw nature had all been mowed through, developed, concrete poured, and the flooding they now deal with as a result, golf courses being established nearby, the runoff. So they now flood in places that they never did before because of the impact, even just from surrounding development. And then, of course, they were looking at this, interstate development right through their community. So thanks to Historic Charleston, who really, quarterbacked for them the effort to apply for their historic designation. They have since received that, and are very, very happy about that. And so that is, at least for now, kind of temporarily staved off the interstate development plan. We are also, especially in South Carolina, but also in the Southeast, the site of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. So this runs from essentially St. Augustine to Southern North Carolina. And these people were an amalgamation of West African cultures born from enslavement on plantation sites, especially. So it's, a fusion culture, if you will, with historic communities still residing, especially in the islands and lowlands today. So what makes us unique geographically? We are incredibly low. So this is, all the images you always see of Charleston, never something you can forget. The one behind me on the wall, a nice daily reminder that the, nuisance sunny day flooding we deal with is a big indicator that we're pretty weak in terms of any sort of resilience or resistance to storm surge as well. So over 1/3 of all homes are built on land less than 10 feet above sea level. And you can see here some of the topography of the peninsula of Charleston. So you can see where the original boundary would have been. The rest is essentially a landfill. It's not actually solid bedrock, hence why the nuisance flooding, just comes up through the ground when we have a rainy day during a king tide. It's pretty much a nightmare scenario for everyone in emergency planning in Charleston. More flooding images, in case you haven't seen enough at this point. So then of course we have to deal with all the implications of this. First and foremost, the damage to resources and infrastructure. But then, we do start to look at the historic and cultural resources that are at risk because of this. And these are all just a few, really, definitely not an exhaustive list of the different threats that we get to deal with. And of course, it's really only getting worse with passing years. These are some lovely images I always like to highlight from Meg and the DNR team. I think they're very effective imagery, especially for archaeological sites, but also just to show the effect on our cultural and natural resources that are coastal right now. So when we look at developing the Lowcountry Alliance for Response, here is our planning committee. You can see we tried to tap, I tried to be very intentional about who I was bringing on to work on this project with me. And I wanted to tap different sectors of heritage. I didn't want it to just be museums, tangible collections. Libraries and archives are huge and very important. Again, especially in Charleston, we have a lot of students that come for them. They're also our cities and our region's cultural memory. And that is, vital for our survival and recovery from any sort of regional event. Historic Charleston Foundation, very active, not just in terms of preserving architectural resources, but also in terms of advocacy and outreach. They're very effective at that. Again, Drayton Hall, as we discussed, kind of covers many, many facets. And having representatives along the way from the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor was really important. It was difficult to find a representative who had the time to work with us. They're stretched very thin, even during the pandemic. They moved their headquarters. They used to be on Johns Island in Charleston County, and then moved down to Beaufort, South Carolina. So, they've definitely, have shrunk as a result of the pandemic. So finding someone who was associated with the corridor or the Gullah Geechee community that had the time and resources to be involved in this was definitely something we had to do a lot of the legwork on, and I would encourage that in the future. It wasn't always easy, I would say, but it's important and necessary. And again, doing 90% of the work to get someone there in order for them to put in that final 10% of what matters most to them, I think is absolutely worthwhile. So looking at the big picture aim and objectives for us, and how we really wanted to tailor our initiative. Of course, just general big umbrella, increasing preparedness and response capabilities. Very broad and generic, but 3 ways we wanted to do that was, first and foremost, fostering local connections. So just knowing who to call. Also for emergency managers and first responders to know that A, we exist, and B, that we are writing plans for these. And also that we exist as a resource. So if they show up to a historic property and there's no one there, they can at least call someone to advise, at least certainly in the aftermath, even if not, during the actual crisis when they're working to stabilize it. We also really want to support local organizations in writing their plans and training staff to carry out these plans. So it doesn't have to be an exhaustive, formal emergency plan that's 100 pages. Often brevity is your friend, but even just having an emergency call list that's updated annually is very important and can be, a make or break for you. And again, in most, emergency aftermaths, as Meg will tell you as well, you have time to kind of collect yourselves and your staff as well. So you generally have time to sort of put these things in motion. You don't want to bank on that. It's definitely better to have these relationships established ahead of time, but you generally will have time to plan a response once the event occurs. And of course, especially in Charleston, the Lowcountry, we wanted to advocate for inclusion of overlooked stakeholders. So this was, this is incredibly important, especially when we think about development. So there's often no one standing in the way to lobby for these cultural resources, and having people that are respected by local officials, I think is going to hopefully be a huge step in that. Maybe that's a little naive and optimistic, but that's what we're left with. So the Kickoff Forum is our official launch event for our Alliance for Response Network in the Lowcountry. After a few delays, we officially held this June 21st, so a couple weeks ago. This was the program we had After so many years of planning, I was really thrilled with the number of people we had that turned out for this. I expected, especially among the fire chief, police chief, and county emergency manager, that at least one or two of those on that panel would have to cancel last minute because of an emergency. But fortunately, it didn't happen. We did have a lot of city county officials, as well as heritage personnel from, again, kind of trying to touch on all aspects of Lowcountry heritage. So archives, libraries, museums, cultural landscapes. We had an urban planner speak with us about with gentrification and working with historic Gullah-Geechee communities in Jacksonville. Former Louisiana SHPO to talk about managing these emergencies from a state level SHPO perspective. And then, state level emergency management, Emily Bentley presented to kind of close out the day and talk about resources at the state level. Not everything was, not that it wasn't perfect. If I'm being critical of our day and the performance, I would say the one shortfall would be that it was very Charleston specific. A lot of the attendees came from Charleston County. Not even that many came from Berkeley or Dorchester, which are just to the north, which I also focused on, especially because North Charleston, which is where we work, tends to be overlooked. So that's definitely something that, we did a lot of groundwork in terms of trying to kind of have a grassroots networking in advance of this. So that's definitely something that I want to focus on going forward, is looping in more of those professionals from the Tri-County area and a bit outward from there, including Georgetown and others. So here's just a photo of the day we had. This was our panel with the county emergency manager, Joe Coates, on the right, the city of Charleston deputy fire chief in the white shirt there. And then to his, our left of him is the city police chief as well. And it was great to get their perspectives. They were very interested in what we were doing, had never heard of anything like this. Even the police chief that day said, this is something I've never thought of before. I love history. And this is something we'll be factoring into our plans going forward, which is someone who has worked on this for 2 years, I can say, is all you really want to hear out of these people. Even if they forget about you the next morning, it's good that they at least know that this exists. We did have some financial sponsors. So working with FAIC, they procured a grant from NEH to allow for funding these different networks and launch events. So we worked with them on that. So they provided a management fee to the host institutions and, travel fees for 2 out-of-town guest speakers. But that was largely it. So in terms of catering, event space, all of that was up to the planning committee to procure either through donations. So Clemson donated event space for the actual day. Avery donated event space for an evening reception to allow for further networking. And then we had funding from the Corridor and the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation to cover the cost of catering, which actually was the most difficult part because that really needs to come from private money, because any sort of public granting body, usually they cannot spend these funds on catering. So we were able, at least fortunately through the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation, it was a small enough amount that they were able to just give us a discretionary grant. And they didn't ask for receipts or particularly care where it came from. So this sounds of any interest to you, especially if you want to, listen to any one of those panels. There was an excellent case study panel as well that Meg presented on. The recording is now available. So you can either access it by going to our website. I emailed our website person yesterday, so this is hot off the press. Or if it's not up yet, you can follow that link directly. I'll try and drop it in the chat after this. So where we go from here, these are just a few examples of AFR-driven policy and planning in the past. So these are, different, relationships that were able to be established and tangible results that have come out of this. If you look at, like South Florida AFR has a seat in the Emergency Operations Center in business and industry, which is potentially a function we might fulfill going forward as well. And this is really kind of the end all be all here. So where we're going from here, So having the launch event and the conference provided an opportunity for feedback from our attendees who are very interested in both virtual lectures, but especially in-person workshops, which was important feedback to get, especially in the virtual age we're in now, that people still want that hands-on in-person training. And again, addressing the needs of our local custodians first and foremost. So friends and neighbors, start there, working and networking, having a list of contacts. South Carolina is a home rule state, meaning local first, which means your city, if you're a city, or county, if you're unincorporated, are going to be your emergency managers and first responders are going to go to first before going to the state level. However, we do need state level coordination, and this is something Meg and I have been working on a lot, especially in South Carolina. So there's a lot of gaps in our existing data that we need to prioritize filling first and foremost. So where are these volunteer-run sites that maybe aren't on official registers? Also, out-of-date assessments, I think about 93% of collections, this is nationally, do not regularly update condition assessments for their collections. So again, I'm sure that number is even worse for a rural state like South Carolina. Management of existing data sets. You know, we have official bodies that manage flooding data. We have official bodies that manage above ground resources, cultural data sets. We have another body that manages the below ground or archaeological data sets. So we need really a quarterback who can kind of merge and be responsible for all these data sets without this kind of siloing of information that really just adversely affects us in the time of a crisis. And again, as I mentioned, a pulse check on our heritage organizations and custodians. So who are they? What are their collections? What do they have in their stores? Where do they need help? How many staff do they have? Those sorts of questions. And then hopefully Meg will be hot on my heels with an AFR in the Midlands coming soon. So we are hoping to work together and sort of influence policy and planning, especially on a state level. But really just the big takeaway from all of this for me along the way has been that we need to be more proactive about quantifying our economic contributions, both locally, state, and nationally. We don't have any sort of numbers on that, even talking to people at SCEMD or people in the business and industry, support function. We lump, I think, cultural and natural together, but even that doesn't have its own number. So what kind of heritage tourism impact do we contribute? And how can we leverage those resources to justify the fact that we are a key driver of economic recovery post disaster event? So I will kind of leave it there with that being the final question to you all. And I'm happy to take any questions you have now.